and it goes to the club. Okay, that was all.
Thank you.
Hi everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our fourth event. Love is a City in Anguish by and with Omar Kasmani. I'm Julia, this is Annelie, and over there is Teresa, and we are part of Zentrum für Netzkunst, an initiative from Berlin researching on net art, both in its historical and contemporary forms. And this year we published a book, From Net City World to Cloud Market Sea, Metaphors of the Internet, and it is, as the title already suggests, about metaphors and how they shape our perceptions, our conceptualizations and imaginations of the internet. And we chose 6 metaphors: net, city, world, cloud, market and sea, to explore how we talk about the internet and also how we have done it in the past. So yeah, with the book we try to tell the history of the internet through the lens of metaphors. And we invited Omar to write about the metaphor of the city. But before we hear and talk about his contribution, we want to thank panke.gallery for hosting us tonight, and Zakowski and Philip for the help. And because they are here tonight, we also want to thank Judith, our fabulous graphic designer. It's such a beautiful book. And and finally we want to thank Hauptstadt Kulturfonds for supporting our project. And if you want to buy a book, you can scan the QR code at the back of the room and order it from Distance, our publisher. And if you want to know more about metaphors, there are 2 more events coming. The next event is with Orit Gatt. It's about the YouTube comments section. And it's next Tuesday in our project space Rosa. And you can find all the information on our website and social media. And yeah, so much for the ad block. And now Annelie will introduce you to Omar.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Omar Kasmani, thank you for coming. Omar is a cultural anthropologist with a background in cultural studies and architecture. He works as guest lecturer at the FU Berlin at the Department for Cultural and Social Anthropology, and before that he used to work as postdoc in the research center Affective Societies, also at the FU Berlin. And in his research he deals with the ideas of intimacy, queer belongings, especially in the city, and queer temporalities, and spans from cultural anthropology to queer theory and affect theory. And he published a book called Queer Companions that deals with saintly affects and public formations of intimacy in contemporary Pakistan in 2022, as well as edited a volume, Pakistan Desires, Queer Futures Elsewhere, which I saw the other day at She Said at Neukölln, a really nice bookshop. And in 2019 he wrote a text titled Thin Attachments, Writing Berlin in Scenes of Daily Love. And that was actually the text that provoked us to invite Omar, since he established a really nice auto-theoretical writing practice in this text, and also deals a lot with the city, not so much with net art or net culture, though there are hints to social media and dating apps. So it was a bit of a stretch to also invite Omar to write for a volume that deals with net culture, but nevertheless he accepted the invitation. And yeah, we will hear more about the city and about queer desires in the city, and especially in relation to Berlin now. And I would hand over to you now.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll just use that mic.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me and the mic works. Yeah. So thanks a lot for being here on this Tuesday night. Thank you for the invitation to present today, but also the invitation to be part of this wonderful project. So thank you, Teresa, Julia, and Annelie, of course. And I'm also very grateful to Judith because once the design process was going on, I got really excited, and it's really beautifully done, every chapter. And I'm presenting the text that I contributed. Two things. One is that there are some minor departures from the text that from the published version of it. I thought that because it's a reading, perhaps this could be another life of the text. So there are some minor departures from what you might see in the book. The other thing is that there are some quiet, meditative, or silent moments in the reading performance, so don't get alarmed if I don't speak for a few seconds. But those are for you to savor those moments too, and I'll read for about 30, 35 max minutes. Suppose a city broken as the heart. Picture a moody web of urban lovers and queer beloveds. Imagine love as it were geography, always shifting, often volatile, occasionally betraying. There exists, in fact, centuries-long tradition of writing the city that summons precisely all that. Common to literatures of the Persianate worlds, Shahr-e-Ashub or city disturber is that poetic genre that enfolds and enacts the sorrow and anguish over social and political upheavals in a city. What's more is that such urban turmoil implicates urban beloveds, mainly a network of boys and craftsmen whose beauty, as chroniclers note, can and does disturb the order of the world. It should explain why a book on Istanbul of the 16th century has 3 sections dedicated to beautiful boys, one of which bears the title, In Description of the Inconstant Beloveds of the City. Such literary cataloguing of a city's beloveds and the political sway their beauties hold belongs to a greater Ottoman pattern, to some extent also traceable in early modern Europe, that renders civic life intimate as much as it outlines how public experience of the urban corresponds with matters of the heart. Contemporary lovers will share some of that knowledge. Whether looking for love online or cruising for sex in public, the city remains an imbrication of material and affective life. As concrete a mesh as it is an elusive grid on a dating app, the urban participates in how love is lived and desire acted out. Even digital intimacies at their remote best thicken public grammars of affection on the ground as they multiply online possibilities and impossibilities of attachment. In his cross-rumination on love in present-day Delhi, Ravish Kumar illustrates how an innermost landscape of feeling is conversant with urban environments and infrastructures, whether they are built, historical, affective, or digital. Ishq Mein Sheher Hona, the book's Hindi-Urdu title, on the one hand evokes the idea that in love we grow into cities, sprawling figures at once adrift, unruly, multiple. On the other, it attunes us to the ways in which love takes on an urban grammar, as conveyed by the book's English title, A City Happens in Love. But what happens when the urban is more than a setting for love and its losses? That is, when the city is the beloved, a shifty lover one takes on, as it were. It was sometime in 2018, he reckons, that he began describing himself as a Berliner by love. It has, for the most part, served as that mushy architecture of belonging that need not be routed through questions of origin or Berliner. It has also helped him bypass the privileged notion that one can choose to be home at will, Wahlberliner. In fact, by articulating his relationship with Berlin in terms of love, he had categorically made it less about choice. What is love if not the condition of being willfully unsovereign? But was it also naive, he now wonders? How had it not occurred to him that one day love will have run its course, for such is love's habit, or that lovers are bound to find other loves, as is known of beloveds, or that even when one is able to keep on loving, love, to lean on Laurent Belland, is that gift that keeps on taking. It is only fair to add that he stood warned by other migrants, one being Musa Okunga, whose words, "Sooner or later Berlin will punch you in the stomach," he now finds hard to ignore. Clearly, he had not quite prepared himself for the affective sprawl that urban betrayal involves. It is 2024, and Berlin feels like a heartbreak. August 2011, 5:24 a.m. My dear Rose, I see that you have now poked me on Facebook. Is it to remind me that I owe you that Berlin story you asked for? Poking feels just so physical. I tried looking up the word. It is to jab or prod someone or something, especially with one's finger. There's also the vulgar slang version. Poke is for a man to have sexual intercourse with another person. I'd rather go with vulgar. Like always, I read your email several times over. It feels like an act of love to revisit your writing, your words spread over several days. Not sure if I have a Berlin story to tell, but I can say that the city has slowly grown on me, and I think I have taken very nicely to Berlin. Of many things, I like its mellow rhythm. There is something leisurely about Berlin's everyday life, no real sense of urgency. My impressions, of course, are limited to areas I frequent, but I can already say that my Berlin is largely a small network of people I like and those I socialize with. Some are in fact strangers, persons I meet in bars and clubs, engage in one-off conversations, part flirtatious, part intellectual, encounters of all kinds really. Then there is a city I know that exists on Gay Romeo. It is sometimes fun to Romeo identify people in public spaces. Berlin can turn a very small place when it chooses to. The anonymity that Berlin once offered me, empowering as it was, is slowly fading, making room for something new. I can't figure it out just yet what that is though. My acquaintances, my friendships, my loves, my encounters are varied, but together they make a map of sorts in which I'm able to locate myself. And on this map are a few nodes. J is one, Belgian, biochemist, postdoc, straight. A very dear friend, a lovable human, and quite unlike others I know. Part of my week revolves around things we do together, or people we meet through each other. Another node is M, German, lawyer, civil servant. A Romeo find. He has been around to take care of me whenever I've needed it most. He's shown a very committed interest, something I've not been able to reciprocate with equal vigor. I do not know why, or perhaps I do. There are so many things that remain unsettled, so much baggage. It seems you've been making your way through my Facebook albums, even if stealthily so, not leaving any traces behind. You'd have noticed that A was here in Berlin and stayed 5 weeks. I was rather nervous at first, but it worked out fine, I guess. We are still in that phase of planning a decent way out of this long relationship. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it was important to me that A could see me live a very different, unapologetic life. I wonder if you sense anything different about me now, were you and I to meet again. I so wish you'd have visited me this year. I love you still, and will do so, Hamesha. Your Kasmani. Whether hopeless lover or migrant, he cannot think of love or its labors without thinking of Berlin. Love, dare he quote a Netflix film, is a lot like moving to a new country, trying to build something where nothing existed before. It's hanging on and letting go, it's messy, it's beautiful, like any giant leap of faith. Though, if there's one thing he has learned through migrating, it is that pasts cannot be left behind, ghosts arrive shortly after, and trauma knows no borders. More importantly, there are no vacant grounds. We arrive in places already thick with history, weighed down by spectres of their own. Why else would the Berlin air feel so packed some days? How little room he finds for histories of his own kind. Still, he likes how love in this otherwise cheesy dialogue stands for an unsettling, moving as much as being moved, at times to our limits, if not also to tears, or that it invariably involves the work of building something new every day, being adrift or becoming different eventually, queer even to our former straight selves. Above all, like love, migration demands of him that he remain faithful, if not also open, to where an intimate journey may or may not take him. He's only coming to realize that in love, there are no destinations, just as migrants do not quite arrive, ever. He sees him again, this time after months. He is 3.2 kilometers away. He closes Grindr on his iPhone without clicking. His heart longs for him still, he realizes. They met like lovers do in films, in a doctor's waiting room. This virology praxis in Neukölln was popular with queers of the Keats. So cute were the lab boys one almost looked forward to contracting STIs. Injections didn't hurt one bit, and Behandlungen almost felt like dates. Or so went the urban legend. On a morning in early August, as he entered this room of waiting gays, he whispered a quick hello, as was custom at German clinics. He sat on a corner chair and pulled out Edouard Glissant from his tote bag. "Is that poetry you're reading?" a masked neighbor inquired from across the no man's chair the two had tactfully left vacant for social distancing. Though he should have duly judged the BIPOC stranger for mistaking poetics with poetry, he allowed himself to embrace the clumsy icebreaker as an invitation to flirt. From behind the anonymity of mask, the two began talking about what they had been reading lately, exchanging names in the process. His name meant love in a language he had grown up with, no matter if the stranger who bore love as name did not speak the language. This would remind him that they had in fact already had this conversation on Grindr, that urban grid where gays ran into love, if not also away from it, and where men were adept at masking themselves long before a pandemic would require it. Soon enough, in the surge of heady flirtations, out came from his repertoire of reading recommendations a history of my brief body. In the slither of time, just before lab boys would call out their Nachnamen, scurry them to respective Behandlungen, plans were made, numbers exchanged, love invited. Sunday evening, while on a walk in Athens, Jana messages him on Twitter, now X. Martin Reichert is no more. So stunned at the news, he doesn't shed a tear. He keeps walking, uttering the words, "Oh Martin, my Martin," not silently, but under his breath. Again and again, so repetitive, it was a mantra. Martin was a companion. He wasn't his friend in the sense that he would see him every weekend for brunch, as he does his other friends. Neither one he would call when in trouble. Martin personified his idea of thin attachments, that is to say, those of our bonds which do not feel thick or grounded, but bear weight and value nonetheless. Remember, thin attachments are not weak or watered down relations, but those which in their attenuated shapes refuse to take conventional paths and substantial futures as the only way to remain meaningful in and to the world. He first met Martin in 2011 at Ficken 3000, that bar with the famous darkroom where Kreuzkirchen queers were known to cruise, hang out, intellectualize, get sexy and all. Tuesday nights were particularly popular, with 2-for-1 drinks on offer. But it must have been a quieter night, he now thinks. Whether they first grabbed each other in the dark or met upstairs by the bar, the image he's able to recall is of Martin perched on a stool in that usual spot of his. Martin drinking a large beer, as was his thing, the disarming smile. Tall and broad, a giant-like presence to his shorter self, but when Martin smiled, and which he often did, he scaled down, as it were, all the more approachable, ever so cuddleable. Seine Umarmung der beste Ort der Welt, as Jana would succinctly describe that feeling of safety they had all felt in his embrace. And this he knew to be true. Theirs was an instantaneous connection. In those early years, they were also neighbors. If they wouldn't run into each other on the street, they would on the grid of dating apps. Each time, upon greeting, a little kiss was exchanged, always on the lips. Though their affair never became a thing, the kiss remained. It was that thin but unmistakably physical trace of a love they did not have, but both in their own ways hung on to. Martin spoke softly and listened like a sage. From boy trouble to life decisions, from Islamic worlds of desire to Berlin's gay history, there was always something to talk about, an argument to be had, sometimes just gay banter. Martin entered his life in a phase which was messy, to say the least. Life decisions had to be taken, new homes made, other loves sought. He was, back then, no Berliner by love. At a time when moving away felt oddly comfortable and moving on ever so difficult, it was Martin who had gently taught him that even straight pasts warranted a morning in the queer present, that we don't slide into queer futures just like that going forward he owed himself time to grieve all that he was giving up, but also that which wasn't made possible for him earlier, elsewhere. In all these years, Martin had been more than a friend, more than a lover. He was his sage, his confidant, his early queer companion. Martin was a hamdam, that Persian Urdu concept for a buddy, the one who figuratively shares your breath, whose heart beats with yours. So incredibly lonely then, for one heart to go on in the city all by itself. So hard to breathe now, no wonder. With the soul-crushing news of him taking his life comes also a parting gift, as it were, one that Martin left him, delivered in Jana's words. Omar, last time I saw him, we talked about you. I don't really know how close you were, but Martin said he really likes you. This, he feels, is Martin's final kiss on his lips, a running into the Keats he couldn't have wished upon himself, but a goodbye that he will, in time, learn to embrace. Crying inconsolably all by himself on a Monday morning at a cafe in Athens, as he's writing these words into notes on his iPhone, the opening lines of an Urdu poem saunter into his mind. Abhi kuch din lagenge, dil aise shahar ke pamal ho jane ka manzar bhoolne mein, abhi kuch din lagenge. It will take a while to recover a city so destroyed as the heart. January 2024, Saturday afternoon, on the U8, Kot Busator. On his way to a protest, he's making plans with a buddy for sex afterwards. He's pretty much engrossed in WhatsApp, but just as the train leaves the platform, in the sliver of time, he catches a scene from the window. What he sees arrests him, for he's not once encountered a scene like this in his 14 years in the city. 4 Arab boys lined up by the Berliner Polizei, their hands up, heads firmly pressed against the blue wall. What feels unsettling just now will no longer be unusual in a few months' time, but he doesn't know this yet. What he recognizes is that unlike his white friends and colleagues, he doesn't have the luxury of looking away. He cannot take distance. He freezes. It is only January, and German silence feels colder than the city's infamous winter. Once at the protest, things feel warmer. There are, as a matter of fact, other aching bodies in the city. He's almost alarmed and ashamed to realize that he's looking forward to a night of abandon. It irks him just as much that he will not mention the P word nor the protest to his buddy, white and German. It had been months since the war in Gaza had broken out and the topic hadn't come between them. He wonders what sex and drugs make impossible in a time as repressed as now, in a place as burdened as Berlin. He's read somewhere that the experience of sex, however intensely mediated through another, is always solo, in that it is never a uniting experience between partners. It is precisely because we are alone in sex, the argument goes, that sex demands repetition. Love, on the contrary, writes Alain Badiou, is that shared ground from which a decentered perspective on the world can grow, the two seen, as the philosopher calls it. He's not particularly convinced of the argument, nor the distinction Badiou makes, and yet he's increasingly privy to how intimacy magnifies the political loneliness looming large in the city. Badiou's image of the two seen, two people sharing a view of the horizon, strikes him as particularly naive, for it assumes a parity of being in the world that is never the experience of colored and othered bodies. Now, more than ever, with every fiber of his being, he knows this to be true. He also knows that this winter is that winter to which he will turn in the future to say, "That is when I first felt in my bones the chill that whiteness is." June 2013, a hospital room in Karachi. 94-year-old Aisha is in coma and, as per the prognosis, soon to pass. His brother and her favorite grandson places the phone closer to Aisha's ears so that he can play an audio file sent from Berlin via WhatsApp. In the recording, made a year and a half earlier by Jeremy, his Belgian bestie who lives in Berlin, one can hear snippets of their grandmother's voice in his parents' garden in Karachi. There isn't much on it save an attempt at a conversation across languages, Urdu and English, the occasional laugh, Karachi birds chirping, but mostly just silence and sprawling dementia. Now and then, a forgetful Aisha turns to Jeremy, asks him his name and where he lives. Each time he says Jeremy, she hears Germany. And when he tells her he lives in Germany, she suspects he's pulling her leg. Laughter follows, though it is loss that pervades this failing exchange. What comes through in silence is a conversation Aisha seems to be having with herself. Every now and then, Aisha breaks into verse. Ata hayat mujhko guzra hua zamana, a refrain they had all come to associate with their grandmother in her final years. It means I'm constantly reminded of a time gone by. Extraordinary string of words for a woman left with little or no recourse to memory. Born sometime around 1919 and never schooled, Aisha had committed many a such poems to memory, in Urdu, not her mother tongue. Unbeknownst to her father, her brothers would smuggle newspapers and literary journals into the home. Aisha's refrain, Ata hai yaad mujhko guzra hua zamana, is the opening line of a famous poem, The Plea of a Bird. An ode to freedom and written mainly for children, the poem takes captivity as a metaphor for the civilizational decline of Indian Muslims. Poems like these played a pivotal role at the turn of the 20th century affecting a collective consciousness for Muslim identity and modern nationhood. Of the many poems from a distant girlhood, this one about freedom would remain Aisha's companion till the end. In The Years, Annie Ernaux observes how memory pairs and sutures, how remembering works as an accumulation of objects through which the subject can once again become the person she was at such and such time. But not always is remembering voluntary, let alone restorative, a willful recourse to becoming whole again. To remember, Aisha must navigate what she has committed to memory in one place, Surat of British India, and which returns to her 8 decades later in another place, Karachi of independent Pakistan. No longer able to actively or reliably recall her past, the past comes to Aisha lovingly, to rely on other verses, to quote a different Urdu poet, like a wasteland in sudden bloom, like a potion that heals. How does one inventory a life cut into geographies? What sutures when the past, not figuratively, but literally, is another country? Though the two were never close in life, questions like these now tie him to his deceased grandmother, both having migrated westwards, both having known a grief with geography that some call home. In the words of Svetlana Boym, one's inability to return home is both personal tragedy and an enabling force. All the more tragic that homes we make away from home should start to work like wounds. Hey na, it's me, Imhotep, IT guy, last day here, looking for trouble, white noise, damaged goods, summer sale this and that, XXL, cream on top, wine and Netflix, und was? Dear M, this here is a long message. It has a prologue, a note, and a postscript. Too bad you met an academic. Prologue. I have been giving our situation much thought this past week, and just yesterday I had composed a new note for you. But then, listening to your post-red wine voice message last night, in vino veritas as they say, it became clear to me that the moment of openness was somehow lost, or that the note I had written was no longer appropriate to the situation we now find ourselves in. And yet, I'm sending it across because 1, it was written for or addressed to you, so you should receive it. And 2, this way, as we move on or step away, I can stay true to some of the ways I have felt towards you. The note, redacted. Postscript. Difference, what you compared to spice once, is not always a bad thing. However, what difference does unfailingly warrant is the work of difference, to work it out, so to speak. It's never enough or simply fun in a Benetton multiculti way that we look, speak, or believe differently, but living with difference actually involves questioning what might have long been familiar to us and a fair amount of openness from both ends. And from what I heard last night, it appears that that space is no longer open, or as in my worst fears, was never available to me. Please understand that none of this is to argue with you further or to lay any blame, less still to convince you to go against your convictions. The latter, I hope you will believe me, never was the point. Just as you have told me enough times now what you do not want, it is only fair that you should know how I have felt. The one point where I do agree with you is that it was too early to discuss what our relationship, if at all, could eventually look like. And yes, politics came in the way, but all I had hoped was to explore more with you without necessarily defining it, and to see where we would arrive at and what we would make of it, the gist of the undelivered note. that I wasn't able to put this across to you better, that you didn't see the exact shade of my feelings, or that we couldn't achieve neither restore the chance that was once burgeoning, is precisely our loss. Hope, though dying last, as they say, is also a hard thing to keep. Like your wish for me, I too have my fingers crossed for your new job, new city. My wish is also that you will find these new beginnings to your liking, and hopefully amid kinder times and companies. Do take care and be well. Gargi Bhattacharya in We the Heartbroken, quotation. Heartbreak is the unhappy knowledge that there is nothing special at all about our individual grief. Heartbreak is a better word for what it feels like when we grasp that every sorrow is repeated, amplified, transposed. When I speak of heartbrokenness, I'm trying to capture this sorrow that moves between individual grief and the consciousness of all that is so broken in our world. Gillian Rose in Love's Work, quotation. The risk of relation is that we are at the mercy of others. In the red parts, Maggie Nelson describes how and why falling out of a story hurts, the story of a love that we might have wanted very much. The loss was probable before it was possible, she admittingly recalls of a love story she knew was bound to fail. And yet, like most people in love, she writes, or maybe like most writers in love, I thought, if I could keep formulating it correctly, if I could keep finding the right words to house it, maybe I could change it. If Nelson attunes us to the charge articulation can take in the world, the capacity we want words to have to house the enormity we know to be love, she also returns us to the sobering realization that however integral to a love story, we are never its sole authors. Is it possible then that his writing is also about falling out of a story, one whose authorship cannot be fully assumed, a love with a city he once very much cherished, but which under present circumstances feels untenable, immoral, disaffecting? When he thinks of unlove, he is not thinking the absence of love, rather its conscious withholding. Unlove is not a placeholder for hate, instead names the affective labor that becomes necessary as the spell breaks, when love no longer is able to govern or steer us. As he parses the city that is also a lover, he recovers fragments of himself in hearts won and broken, in attachments thin and thick, in loves unfinished and sex not had, in romances he now wishes would have become something, as well as in affairs that never quite took off. For one who's only approached the city in terms of love, Okwonga's image of Berlin as a racist atmosphere is quite the revelation. A city where weather-based injuries are felt only among migrants, where out of the blue, Berliners of color become inflicted with bruises, attacked by the air as it were. He knows all too well the gravity of minor feeling, when a lover does not return the very affections it demands of you, when home fails to inhabit you the way you inhabit it, when a place does not grow on you as much as it grows around you, or when a city turns on you like a beloved in betrayal. Of Berlin, he cannot say just yet if the heartbreak he feels today will lead to a breakup tomorrow. Time will tell. For now, he seeks solace in a poem. Where he comes from, breaking into verse is routine, and turning to verse doubles as a practice of divination. In the poem Love and Other Experiments, he reads, "Sometimes not loving is the most radical thing you can do." Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful reading. It was so nice to hear also the parts that weren't in the book. So yeah, Annelie and I prepared some questions for the talk. But we would really like it to be more an open conversation. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask them anytime. So to start, your text is part of the city metaphor in the book, and the other two contributions are by Olia Lialina and Joachim Blank, and they wrote about online cities like GeoCities and Internationale Stadt Berlin, and they wrote about these online cities and mostly about the conceptual transfer of structures and infrastructures, and you, on the other hand, focus more on the social dimensions of a city and the relationships and the human interactions, and also this intermingling of online and offline worlds. And for me, your text really shows how social media and messengers and dating apps are entangled in our everyday city life. And I was thinking maybe you could talk a little bit more about these online-offline connections and how they relate to each other, and also to include the city, how you think the smartphone changes the experience of these social cities.
Thank you. I think I also took the text as an invitation. I mean, you had already mentioned in the introduction that I don't necessarily write about internet culture or art, although in the work, of course. So this became an opportunity to sort of, let's say, curate the texts that were more about this interface between the digital and the, let's say, the architectural or the built environment. But for me, the city is also an interface between the emotional and the material, right? So there is this, so the interface is much more than just, or the translation is much more, is not only between, let's say, the digital, the online and the offline, so to speak, but I say that I understand the city as a kind of a interface between how we feel on the inside and what we experience on the outside, right? So this kind of, so the question of intimacy then becomes something that is the way I walk into the topic or into the city, so to speak. And there, the apps, I think, somehow accelerate that experience sometimes. I don't think apps fundamentally change the way in which we feel. I think there is an aspect of, as you know, so when we're on a dating app, so to speak, the city sometimes feels full of desire, right? The first interaction or the first impression, of course, is that this, oh my God, it's full of possibilities, right? It feels like a very democratic space. It feels like a kind of a grid that is full of possibilities and promises. And the moment you start actually going through those profiles, you realize that there are barriers like there are in the city, or that you might approach people and you might not get responses, right? So those physical barriers that we, and even racism and all those kinds of things that sort of limit or affect our experience in terms of feeling, they're already very much present also in the digital space, right? So in that sense, I think there's sometimes a certain level of acceleration that happens. I'm not a scholar of the internet, so I cannot sort of ground this in some theory, but just so for me, I think it's interesting how to think across these and not sort of privilege one over the other, but to think of the city as an imbrication of all these layers, the historical and therefore also the ontological, the idea of the future, the question of belonging, the question of attachment and intimacy, that there's this kind of search, whether on the apps, and not just sexual, right? So desire in intimacy, desire in this work or in my larger work is not only physical and sexual, it's also about coming close to one's histories or things we've left behind or we might, want in the future. So there's a kind of a longing which is much more than the question of the sexual or the physical. So that's a kind of a way to think across these.
Yeah, it was really interesting to listen or also watch you read the text, because of course with this gaps in between it becomes so performative, and also the different languages give them a whole different rhythm. So it was really nice to actually listen you reading the text. It's completely different than reading it in the book somehow. And I also know you said that when we spoke about the text, you said you wanted to try something new with more images, or like the hierarchy between text and image to kind of shift it. So I was wondering how that goes or went for you, or how you think about this approach, if you want to proceed with that. Maybe.
Yeah, images are kind of new. I've been taking photographs. I always do, even in my previous research. There's always some kind of but in this project, it's been a kind of image has been a companion, but unconscious or subconsciously so. And it's very recently that I thought that images, of course, are scenes in and of themselves, right? I've been calling these fragments scenes in my work. I call them scenes because I see them as passages of time, and sometimes not much is happening, but you're just invested in a scene. And so images lend themselves very easily into this form or in this constellation of scenes, so to speak. And I've never presented them like this. So I thought, okay, let me try this. I have also been, especially with this particular text, because I think the other thread which I've realized is poetry. So there is, of course, love, intimacy, all of that, but there is I even begin this text with this poetic genre, Shahar Ashub, the city disturber, as a way to think about why matters of the heart have to do with urban politics or urban turmoil, or how can they be related. And I relate it to the genre or literary form. And then I realized that I break into verse and my grandmother breaks into verse, and there are all these kinds of moments where there is the question of the poetic. So while thinking about this particular presentation, I was really thinking about adding a soundtrack of music, and I stopped because I thought it could become too cheesy. I started making a playlist of which is, but I think I will try it out because I've been thinking about how poetry in its abstraction, and especially because the kind of context I grew up in, the poetic is deeply it's a very profound way to express emotion and feeling. And it's also thinking about the brokenness of the text, right? This is fragmented work. It's actually part of the book that I'm writing, which is this body of scenes and fragments. I was thinking about, I grew up watching Bollywood, of course, but also beyond Bollywood, the structure, the brokenness of the narrative, right, is punctured through song. And song is not a break necessarily, it's an extension. It's things that cannot be conveyed in dialogue, right? So you turn to music, you turn to poetry, especially to express intimacy, desire, sexuality, all those kinds of things that are hard to put in words or hard to certainly express in prose or dialogue. So I've been thinking of sort of at least a performative version of the text to have song. So that could be another dimension to work, or another kind of sense to work with, the sound versus the image. But I also didn't want to layer the sound on the image. There were all these ways in which I thought, no, this is not the right space. I have to first try the images out, in another iteration, maybe think about sound and or song, so to speak.
Yeah, should I just speak like that? Or?
Yeah, you can.
So I know your writing, and I know you've recycled some passages, scenes, and to try to link to what you said in the introduction about the internet, I thought that your writing process somehow, like these scenes, they kind of move together, or you join them as if you were linking them, because you open up like completely different contexts, right? Like now we're in Karachi, now we're in India, now we're in Berlin, now we're in Kreuzberg, whatever, right? So it's kind of like it kind of, you know, I think you could kind of think along the lines of linking or hyperlinking and making these connections through you as the author. But I kind of wanted to ask you about the recycling and the process of like connecting these completely different scenes and quotes that are sometimes, when you're reading, like obviously quotes because you name the author, but sometimes you don't. Like I guess just want to ask you about the, like, it is like almost like an art. Like, can you talk about the writing process, like how you choose the scenes and why, you know, and how do you recycle them and when do you upcycle them and all these things? In order to, because I discovered, like, recognize a few passages from other works. So, do you want to speak to the process of, like, how you link the scenes together?
Yeah, it's helpful to think in this way, but I think for me, part of what the fragmented structure affords is reconstellating it or finding other constellations for different contexts. So even if I have a body of work already written, I always, when I'm asked to share this work, it depends on what kind of context I'm in, and I decide what kinds of scenes. You know, you can sort of, it's a curation, it's a recuration every time. But you're right, there's also a bit of recycling that happens in the sense, or upcycling, that I take certain parts of scenes and join them into other stories, because the writing also grows, right? I've been writing this since 2016. So there are various bits from here and there, which suddenly sometimes make a different, or when I read them from the present, I read them now, you know, what I had written before, they make a different sense, or this a certain kind of aspect becomes more important. Also, when you constellate the same scenes in a different curation, different linkages appear across scenes, right? I see from the point of view as a writer or as a composer, so to speak, I say that this is a thinness of the text itself. This is what it affords, right? So I use that. But also the city, as you said, this thing about the past or the present or different places. I make the argument that my Berlin, or certainly I think migrant Berlin, is not defined by the physical borders of this city, right? Migrants do operate in multiple time zones, and they've lived in other places. So your city, or my Berlin, very easily bleeds into Berlin, into Karachi or other places, or Athens, where, you know, places I frequent or where I've lived, or London. And for me, this does not disturb the fact, it still remains a story about Berlin, right? And that porosity, for me, is the very experience of the city. I can only experience the city through that, you know, through its porous constitution. So that helps me think about those thin attachments, so to speak. So thin in the work, more than a conceptual gesture, is also a methodological impulse for me, right? So that is one way to think about the creativity that you're inviting me to consider. Yeah. There's a hand somewhere there. Oh, you were scratching.
Yeah, maybe it would be good to come to thin attachments again and what that means, because of course that's a term that you used in previous work, so maybe you could describe a little bit what you mean with that.
Yeah, a cop-out answer to that is, at least for the book, I say it means different things in different instances. Because also I think I don't want to make this kind of, with a fragmented book, I don't want to necessarily say that this is one kind of, not straight, but kind of consistent way of thinking about thin. It is, as I said, it's both a conceptual gesture and a methodological impulse. I think about what thin writing is. I think about writing as something also cruisy, which is sort of which has this element of hope, but can also be those affects of hope can fail, right? As in cruising, it's driven by hope, but it doesn't mean that you will always achieve the object of desire, so to speak. But it's a pursuit, right? It's an open-ended pursuit in a defined kind of field, right? In a predefined field. Cruisers know where to cruise in a way. So there is some level of control, but at the same time there is an openness to it. So that's also thinness for me. But thin, as I mentioned in the fragment or scene about Martin, I talk about how thin are not weak or watered down relations, but there is a certain kind. But they're also not. They also don't take ground in ways that conventional relations take, right? And that is not necessarily the condition for it to be meaningful into the world. So it can take futures that are or things that progress not in straight time, so to speak, or do not relations that do not prosper in ways that we imagine relationships to be. And yet at the same time, and Martin in that sense is really that personification where somebody somebody who wasn't a daily figure or a figure in my daily life, and yet had held this kind of value, right, which cannot be described in through ideas of density or thickness or right. It's not a conventional relationship. So I'm thinking about a kind of a plurality of relations and what they can do and how they can, that plurality of relations or multiplicity of relations, and they don't necessarily need to be romantic all the time. They can be with places, with people, with pasts, with grandparents, with siblings, all kinds of relations. How they hold us in a way, like how that is the ground that is meaningful, and not only look at who's my boyfriend or who's my partner and who's the one love, the great one love that I had. I've come to understand when I wrote this text, I realized that I'm giving Berlin this singularity that is not the character of how I think about love, right? It's become this one big lover that I'm talking as if this one big betrayal. One doesn't have to think about home in monogamous ways as well, right? I have multiple ways to belong, and so even if a city betrays you, it's not the end of the world. It's a heartbreak, or it can be, So in a way, I think this text gives the false impression, or I was under the false impression also, that there's this kind of big love story. But I think there are always thin attachments in my life, or there are these plural ways of being related in and to the world. And that is what I'm trying to get at, I think. To see value in that.
So one can feel when one listens to you, it's a really personal text, and also it was a personal presentation, and maybe it's another more formal question, why he, not I?
Well, in 2016, I was reading a book by Kathleen Stewart. It's called Ordinary Affects, and she writes about Austin in the third person. And at the time, I was doing a research in a mosque in my neighborhood, and I was really conflicted about that research because I didn't want to. Yeah, it felt really odd to be a migrant and write about other migrants. And also this whole idea about this whole conversation about Islam in Germany I'm deeply disinterested in. So I was like, I'm getting into a project that I sort of don't sort of see as exciting. And so what I did was I started writing about myself in the mosque in the third person. I thought this could be like field notes, like what anthropologists do. And that turned into a book project. Because what it did was I realized that I wasn't just watching other migrants, I was watching myself, watching others, right? So it gave me this extra remove. And the moment so as artificial a device this is, the moment I sort of allowed myself that remove, I realized that I could write about intimate things much more comfortably, even if I know that I'm writing about myself, right? So you can pretend that you're not writing about yourself, and it gives you a certain kind of it's a device, but it works for me. The other thing is, once I started doing that, I realized that now gender is the ordinary refrain of the text, which I really like. It's very clear that this is a cis male access. I mean, of course, class is also there in the text. It's about the spaces I inhabit and a social milieu. But gender pervades the text as an ordinary refrain. I like that. And sometimes because it's a lot about queer or gay intimacies, I like when people have to read something again, or when they listen, they don't know which he is he. I like that confusion. I remember this once, one of the iterations of the text was being translated into German, and my translator, I have to say that person was probably very straight, but very good translation, but they were also thinking very straight, and they said something like, I am so annoyed by your text. But they did a great job, and they constantly said, but this is confusing, who knows which he is he? And I was like, but that is what I want. It's a queer thing to have this kind of interaction with the text, and you go back and you read again, and when you listen, you miss out, and that's fine. That kind of mistake is quite welcome, I would say. But it does sort of create this, which I like. So that, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks, Omar, for your reading and for sharing your emotion. And you talk about positive and negative emotions regarding love, belonging, intimacy, but also heartbreak, betrayed. And the title is then Love is a City of Anguish, so a very strong word. Can you tell us a little bit more about the title and were there maybe other titles you had in mind?
That's interesting, because I think what I can say to that is this text is definitely a reflection of the year I've had, or a year and a half I've had, and you're also privy to some of those conversations. And interestingly, I wasn't able to write since the war in Gaza broke out, and how my relationship to the city was changing, and I realized, how do I write about a city that I've been sort of describing in terms of love? And so there was a blockage, literally. And when you guys invited me to write a text about the city, I literally said, okay, this could be the moment. Yeah, I can force myself to. So I think what this text reflects is not so much the book, because I think the book also has its lighter moments, because also I've had nicer moments with this lover. But this particular text really reflects what I was thinking in that moment, which is about political turmoil in the city and how it's affecting how I also interact with men in the city, right? So love is a city in anguish is a way to think about, first of all, this poetic genre, Shahar Ashu, which is about city disturber, the beloved who's a city disturber. So it connects to that, and it sort of really captures, the more recent times in my relationship with Berlin. But it certainly is not it's not a reflection on the entire book, so to speak. If that answers your question in a way, I think it's this. Yeah, I think intimacy. What it has also reminded me is to think about intimacy and its relation to violence. Fanuel Antwi, my dear friend, he has this line in his book. The book I can highly recommend. It's called On Cuddling. It's a book that I think I can highly recommend to read. It's by Pluto Press. And he says something like, oppression and violence have never been foreign to intimacy, right? So intimacy is also not only the affirmative, the things we like, the positive, but intimacy is also bring us in contact, or sometimes too close, to scenes and situations that are unpleasant, that we would rather look away from. But it's this encounter. Because I think love and intimacy is also not only about attachment. I think attachment always happens at the expense of other attachments. We violate some attachments to make space for other attachments, right? So there is this kind of constant element of attaching and detaching, and I think this text, there's a lot of loss in this compilation. So all I want to say is that 14 years of Berlin are not all about loss. So it's a record of the time, so to speak. And I remember when I wrote this scene, there's a watermelon between us. I think when the editors, when you first read the text, it was a little more coded, because I think I also didn't know how much to sort of express, and I was being more, coded. And I think you guys invited me, you sort of said, put a date to it, write what it is about, because in a few years when somebody reads it, they will not know. Even I think now the watermelon, I think nobody will forget, but just so I put things down, I named Gaza, which wasn't there, because I was just hinting at things, and I put that it's 2024, those kinds of things, right? So in that sense, it's a record of a particular, bracket in a long relationship.
Yeah.
Well, so just to follow up on that, since you mentioned that you hint at some things, I've been wanting to ask you the question about the poetic, because you start with a poem and then you thread the whole text with the poetic language, that you're an anthropologist, and I have no idea about anthropology. It just strikes me as obvious that there's a lot of things that are not said. Just as you mentioned, you hinted things, and then the editors said, why don't you say it outright? So then my question, I think I've asked you this, we've had this conversation before, but I still want to reiterate the question, how do you use poetry as an anthropologist? You write in a very poetic way, and the text is threaded with poetry. So what is the role of the saying things and not saying things, and the interstices, and how do you use that as a strategy, I guess?
I think what I like about the poems, so to speak, as a form, is that it can feel very dense, and at the same time it's about an economy of words. My relationship to the poem or the poetic is that it can be very elusive and dense, and at the same time I can find a way to inhabit a text, or a poetic text. That's my relationship to poetry, and that's something that I really cherish, I think. And I also recognize that when I'm not only that I'm the most moved by poetry, but that I return to the poetic again and again to find solace, to find inspiration. So I think that's perhaps for me the highest form of writing for me. It's a very subjective view. I don't pretend to be. I don't write with the gesture that I'm a poet. You find my writing poetic. Thank you. But I think it's probably the relation to language, which is very metaphorical and elusive. I remember my editor when I was writing my first book. She turned to me and she said, "You write in," her words were, "densely elusive ways." And I found that very helpful to understand my own relationship to writing. That there is an imagery involved, or as my friend Max, who you also know, says about my academic text, he says, "You hardly explain anything, you evoke things." So sometimes when he finds an explanation in my text, he marks it and says, "Oh, you're explaining something here." It's quite rare for an So anthropologists tend to explain things. It reminds me of Heather Love talks about thin description, and for her, she's not an anthropologist, but Heather Love talks about thin description as something that describes something without being masterful about explaining or describing. Anthropologists do what they do, or many social science scholars will do this. They will describe something and then say, this is what is actually happening, right? There's this kind of mastery, and thin description is to resist that move. So what I try to do in these scenes, so to speak, is to allow people, hopefully my readers, to find something of their own, right? The meaning I intend is no more important than the meaning a reader might take from a text. So I'm not trying to say, well, this is actually happening. I'm telling stories, and the act of this is to say, well, is there a way you can walk into this, right? And make your own meaning. So sometimes those meanings only appear across scenes, right? There are certain things that repeat. So the poetic, here it's a thread, a smaller way, but in the book you can't do that. It's not like every few pages I'll write a poem or something, or mention a poem. But again, every opportunity to constellate is an opportunity to thread it differently or slightly differently. And in this case, even through, I think, having now read it or preparing for this, I realized it's not just intimacy and the city and digital, which is obvious because of the context in which it appears. I realized the poetic is also another thread here. And it's probably because I've been thinking about poetry the last, especially I'm sort of systematically thinking about poetry the last 2 years, that. So maybe that's also showing in the work now. There was a hand there.
Yeah.
Please.
So I'm trying to grasp this effort of using the city of Anguish as a metaphor of love, or as image to describe this love. And in general, it seems as all these scenes are sort of temporary or maybe even elusive images of approximating this meaning or this object of focus, right? And so in my own experience, I feel like I've landed at a metaphor that was so fucking good. It was like exactly it. And then when my friend explains to me that they didn't get it, I'm invited to invent another one. It feels entirely alien, entirely awful, like I couldn't possibly. No, that was the image. This is the only image now that fits. And I've constrained my mind to focus that this is now the only way to truly map the object of concern. And you look through several metaphors or maps, like the literal sort of app-based maps and the grids and the profiles, and then also the grander metaphors. And I'm thinking, is there a moment in your writing or in your experience with this where you are ready to forego one of the metaphors that now this no longer fits, because once you've developed the next one, that door has closed, another one has opened. Now this is the way to perceive love or the city in Anguish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I see it as a gathering of metaphors, so to speak. I think the path from the metaphor to the object of concern, as you put it, if that is available to the reader, then they will all arrive, hopefully, to something, to approximately that. Do you know what I mean? So the metaphor does not matter. It's the path from the metaphor to the object of concern. I also think that I am not. I often think that every reader doesn't need to get everything, right? So sometimes I don't translate things. There was a title in Urdu that I did not read out, and I think my own relationship to text is also I don't understand everything. I think it's fine to not grasp everything, or not to make everything accessible to everyone. So for me, I think people or readers will have varied relationship to one's text anyway. So I'm not trying to, let's say, control that in my writing. But also I think that multiplicity, or that, let's say, picking up a metaphor and not building it, not picking it up again, is completely fine in a body of fragments, I would say. Because again, there are things that I, as an author, cannot foresee or plan. It's when readers come in, that's the kind of, for me, like, writing is more like an overture you make. Yeah, it's almost like it's like a joke or a flirtation. You don't know whether it will land, or the way in which, you cannot really plan how it will land. But the hope is that it will. So it's you make a move, and then then readers come in, and they have their moves, I would say, of figuring out what's happening. And that's why I think when something is out and we share and other people come back with their responses, we learn something, because you realize, oh, this is what they bring to the text, so to speak. Do you know? Do you get what I'm saying, or am I just?
Okay. So it's just, I guess, in my own practice, I recently saw Kate Crawford's Genealogy of Empire at Carnegie, which is an amazing work that maps out the occurrence of AI from 500 years of extractivist politics. And I have looked onto that object of concern myself a lot, and always only ever sort of conceded to paint small little briefcase images of what that could be. And here she snapped the entire thing out, and it's ludicrous and amazing, and it's well done. And so all of a sudden she instead of scattering herself around the elephant to describe the elephant in parts for us to accumulate the whole, she managed to produce the whole map of the thing, or at least in my small little person in front of her giant map felt like that, right? So I'm thinking there is, for me, I was invited now this year to think about this new, instead of thinking about creating these fragmented images that amount to the whole. I saw this artist who somehow managed to produce the whole, and I'm inspired. And I'm wondering where you are in that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there is something spectacular about the scale of the city, let's say, to write about the city. Also a very masculine thing to do, I have to say. Very bourgeois, very male. I mean, who has the luxury and the privilege to just sit and observe the city, so to speak? So I recognize that. But as I said, it didn't start, I think maybe had I thought, I'm going to write a book about Berlin, it would have been a bit, that would have been a burden, really, almost, But it started off, as I said, in this mosque where I was figuring out this relation with another migrant community and thinking, it came out of anxiety of doing research. And then when I realized that I'm in this mosque, why am I writing about the mosque, which is in my neighborhood anyway, and these are my neighbors? I'm singling them out because I only see them in the mosque, but I actually cross paths with them, right? And I'm having, there's a bar where I'm having a drink, which is not far from the mosque, and there are clubs and whatever. So I started writing about these other spaces. So I think it grew, right, out of these. I thought about all the places that I was inhabiting or had a relationship with or when I was observing, which was not just about work, but it became this thing. So I think, yeah, the scale emerged out of a very, very intimate scale, but then became about the city. And it was a time when I think I had this conversation in my head that Berlin is home. And sort of, it was coterminous with processes of homing and belonging back in 2016. So I think I realized that in moments when I'm really comfortable with my relationship with Berlin, I stop writing. Because the relationship is no longer thin, maybe, I don't know, but it's settled. And this whole, the new crisis that we're all living through, the world coming apart, it's sort of, even with the first moment, the first response was, I cannot write, it's too big. And I remember thinking about scale, I was trying to write this moment of how I'm feeling. And I shared it with one of my friends who I always share my text with. And I told him, I said, it seems I'm screaming at Germans, white Germans all the time. Anything I write is like I'm giving a lecture, right? And he reminded me, he said, your work is not about the event. Your work is about things that are completely ordinary, but you find a way to sort of address, from the intimate, you can address the political. And that's how, because all these scenes have happened of, there's one scene that I've not written about because it's just so bizarre for me. It's like the basic crux of that scene is, what's a good time to talk about genocide during a sex date, right? Because I once invited somebody, as happens, you don't ask names or something, you just invite somebody for a sex date, and the person sends me their number as a WhatsApp number to say, oh, I'm on the way, and I immediately recognize that it's an Israeli number. So I could not stop thinking about, what happens now? What happens to my politics now? Do we have to discuss this before we have sex, right? And why should I assume this person's politics anyway, right? So it's not about that person, it's about the conflict that I have, right? It's it's an intimate moment. And what happens when, what happens when in the middle of the night, this person takes out his phone, talks about very intimate things about their father abandoning them, or their mother serving food to soldiers, or cooking food for soldiers. And you're in this intimate moment, you're confronting, you haven't signed up for that, but you have to confront this somehow. What do you do with this moment, right? So I realized that I don't have to necessarily go and look for bigger scales, right? All of that is already there, given to us, is passed to us in the minutiae of life, which could be a sex date, or which could be an encounter at a supermarket, or walking by, So it's all these kinds of things. And I said, it's not about the other. At the end of the day, it's about how I reconcile with what do I want to detach from, how do I attach? And how can that attachment operate at the expense of other, you have to violate attachments in order to attach. That is a perfect scene for me, but I've not been able to write. But that's those are the kinds of scenes I have to look at, rather than saying, what's wrong with the German state, for example. So.
I don't know if it's too late for this question, maybe we already passed that, but as I was rereading the text for tonight, I was again also looking for the metaphor of the city, and like in compared to the other two contributions where, you're bringing the concept of city and you're projecting it on the internet, I was trying to find it somewhere here, and I was thinking, well, maybe it's the city as a lover, that's like very metaphorical, but now as you're speaking or as you're talking, I find it kind of interesting that there's this like border between poetic, metaphoric, and virtual. And I feel like they all offer this kind of uncertainty. And I feel as like there's like one part of me which like so much relates to this experience of the cities and of friendships and of affects, which is moving from different cities, installing different apps, but at the end, like there's a certain like a mode that you live between like these virtual poetic places, like always thinking about the other place. No, but I also like really think that we need to cherish or to invite this uncertainty again. And I think that you are articulating it very well now in this like, personal spaces, to be able to be okay with the uncertainty and try
Mm.
to kind of trust that the uncertainty is fine. So I feel like there's something very, very like contemporary experience of the virtual which feels so like real, and I think you can really embody it into text. No question, sorry, maybe.
No, it makes me think about this wonderful book by Emily Ogden. It's called On Not Knowing. I think this being comfortable with not knowing something, or being comfortable with the uncertainty of something, is also a thing we can inculcate as a queer mode of being in the world, I would say. But also, I think what you described, and I think you've addressed, we talked about it earlier, you described that in the introduction to the book very well. This question of the metaphor, and Anne Carson's poem is just absolute wonderful to begin with. Whereas this idea that metaphor is also this kind of, there's this element of being mistaken. It gives you there's a juxtaposition between what is and what is not the case. But there's a moment of being mistaken. And that mistakenness, she says, is of value, right? So I think we can think about the virtual. It's not just about the fleetingness of it, but it's also the virtual, the digital, as you said, the metaphoric, the poetic have in common is this idea of sort of, this mistakenness, which is valuable, right?
But right now quite unforgettable online.
Yeah.
Like being mistaken online is now, you can't.
Being a?
Making mistakes, like I
yeah,
feel like in
exactly.
the online right now, you cannot make mistakes,
You cannot
really.
make mistakes.
And if you make mistake, then you need to claim yourself, or disappear.
But I think the virtual appears to us in ways that the metaphor appears to us in that sense, right? It's not the idea of making a mistake in the virtual mode, but the virtual itself has this kind of character and quality that the metaphoric would have. I think I'm just trying to think, because you create this link between the poetic, the metaphoric, and the digital, virtual. Yeah.
It's Alan Watts who says that all maps are mistranslations. No, am I correct?
Who says that?
Alan Watts, I think. And so it's this idea, or you can paint a map of the country, of the pathway, of the city. You can geolocate all your lovers on an app. You can always do these things, but they will only ever be mistranslations of the reality, right? And so you can have different strategies towards it. You can try your very best to minimize this mistranslation so that misunderstanding or mistake rarely happens. Or you can use poetics to expand that mistranslation, so to create room for subjectivity, for creativity, for reading. And so, he notes it, and he boils it down. He says it about maps, but really he paraphrases to read about everything, even word. Right, like you say, we are now concerned with love, but also love is only a placeholder for describing something that might be entirely subjective for every single one of us. I love the description you gave. On a willingness to unsovereignty, willful unsovereignty.
Yeah. That's paraphrasing Lord Bellant, I should say. But also Bellant says, love will always exceed the accounts we're able to give of it, something like that, right? So it's like that. It's always going to be an approximation and possibly even a mistranslation. But again, I think at some point I said this, we want words to have the capacity to house the enormity that we think is love, right? So at the same, yes, sure, it's hard to capture, but we want words, we want something to describe it. And in fact, love for love, I think, it only becomes a thing in the world once we turn it in, give it a shape of story. Love, I think otherwise it's not a thing in the world. We all then we can talk about love. I think the moment we talk about love, it becomes a thing in the world. So for love to be a thing in the world, we give it the shape of a story. So again, you need that mistranslation, you need that approximation, knowing well that you will always, it will always exceed, the feeling will always exceed the account you're able to give of it. But at the same time, that's the only way you can not capture, but sort of hold it for a little time, right, for the time being. That's then also this idea of the story that Nelson is talking about, like falling in love is like falling into a story, and falling out of a story hurts. So
Yeah, maybe we can
Yes.
close there. Thank you so much, and
Thank
thank you
you.
for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.